Good Monday morning to ya. It's good to see you. Well, not really, because this is being pre-recorded and we're asynchronous this week. So your module for this week will have videos that you will watch, and you can follow along on the PowerPoint. And we have some fun exercises for you to do too. I will begin with an excerpt from A New Earth. Eckhart Tolle is actually talking about sin, and that is what we're going to focus on today. Sin. Ooh. If we look more deeply into humanity's ancient religions and spiritual traditions, we will find that underneath the many surface differences, there are two core insights most of them agree on. The words they use to describe those insights differ, yet they all point to a twofold fundamental truth. The first part of this truth is the realization that the normal state of mind of most human beings contains a strong element of what we might call dysfunction or even madness. Certain teachings at the heart of Hinduism perhaps come closest to seeing this dysfunction as a form of collective mental illness. They call it Maya, the veil of delusion. Ramana Maharshi, one of the greatest Indian sages, bluntly states, the mind is Maya, a veil of delusion. Buddhism uses different terms. According to the Buddha, the human mind in its normal state creates dukkha. This can be translated as suffering, unsatisfactoriness, or just plain misery. He sees it as a characteristic of the human condition. Wherever you go, whatever you do, says the Buddha, you will encounter dukkha, and it will manifest in every situation sooner or later. According to Christian teachings, right, which stem from the Hebrew Bible, which is what we read from today. According to Christian teachings, the normal collective state of humanity is one of original sin. Sin is a word that has been greatly misunderstood and misinterpreted, literally translated from the ancient Greek in which the New Testament was written. To sin means to miss the mark. As an archer who misses the target, pew, so to sin means to miss the point of human existence. It means to live unskillfully, blindly, and thus to suffer and to cause suffering. Again, the term, stripped of its cultural baggage and misinterpretations, points to the dysfunction inherent in the human condition. The achievements of humanity are impressive and undeniable. We have created sublime works of music, literature, painting, architecture, and sculpture. More recently, science and technology have brought about radical changes in the way we live and have enabled us to do and create things that would have been considered miraculous even 200 years ago. No doubt the human mind is highly intelligent. Yet its very intelligence is tainted by madness. Science and technology have magnified the destructive impact that the dysfunction of the human mind has upon the planet, other life forms, and upon humans themselves. That is why the history of the 20th century is where that dysfunction, that collective insanity, can be most clearly recognized. A further factor is that this dysfunction is actually intensifying and accelerating. Interesting to think about, right? I mean, he gives us sort of an argument for why our world is getting a lot more complicated and why we are finding ourselves in such a predicament now. So let's think about this, right? Let's think about what this passage that we read for today, specifically Genesis 1-3, what does it say about sin, right? How is it trying to deal with this issue of sin? In what ways is specifically Genesis 2 and 3, and we're going to start there first, and then we'll go back later in the week to Genesis 1, but how is it dealing with the problem of sin and human error or mistakes, or possibly, as Tolle says, dysfunction or madness? Something to think about, right? So I want to remind us again, and you can go to the next slide on the PowerPoint, that we're talking about the three worlds of the text, right? The world behind, which is the historical context, the world inside, which is the literary context, and we'll look today specifically at the characters in Genesis 2 and 3, and then the world in front, which is the reader's context. So let's take a look at Genesis 3:12-19. I'm going to read it out loud for us, and then I am going to ask you to do a flip grid. I'm going to ask you an interesting question and see what your thoughts are on this. The man said to the woman, the man said, the woman whom you gave to me to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate it. Then the Lord God said to the woman, what is this that you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent tricked me and I ate." The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." And to the woman he said, so that is the serpent's punishment. To the woman he said, "I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And to the man he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." So what happens in this situation, right, is that God says, don't eat of this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and yet they eat. And God, who is anthropomorphized and is actually in this part of the text more like a human, right? God comes to them and asks them, right, "Why did you eat?" And interestingly, in this situation, what happens? The man blames the woman, right? They actually, want to blame each other, as we are prone to do as humans. What I want to ask you is, in thinking through this passage, who do you think is actually to blame? Out of the characters in this story, the world inside the text, is it Adam? Is it Eve? Is it the serpent? Is it God? Or is it all of the above? So take some time right now and do that. Who do you think is to blame? Great job. Some very interesting arguments you've made. All right, you guys, I want you to think a little bit about what you notice in this text, right? If we think about the punishments, right? Interesting that we've got the man being punished with labor, work, and the woman being punished with labor, giving birth, right? Fascinating. And what we're going to think about in a little bit is how this passage might have functioned in the world behind the text, right? In its historical context. What would have been the purpose for this? We could read it literally as a story about a real serpent, a real first man, and a real first woman being created, or we could read it figuratively and think about the ways in which this passage conveys another idea or other ideas, right, to teach. So moving on to the next slide, we will talk about then in this week, myths, cosmologies, etiologies, don't worry, we'll get there, ideologies. We're going to talk about individualism and communitarianism, oral and literary cultures. We'll talk about literal versus figurative, allegorical, and or symbolic readings, and we'll talk about the Bible and biology. And we're going to have, if you have already noticed on the module, right, a debate in the discussion room this week about creation versus evolution. What do you think? Is it one or other or both? But first, heading to the next slide, I want us to think about the ways in which this word myth, right, has become kind of a four-letter word. And when I say the word myth, right, what words, images, or ideas or stories actually come to mind? I want you to think about that right now. When you hear the word myth, what do you think of? Often, right, we think false, untrue. And I would say that's pretty normal, pretty standard. Growing up like we have in the United States, learning that myths are stories, right? We think of maybe Greek mythology. We would never think that that was a real thing, right? But what's interesting is thinking about the difference between something being fact and something being true, because something can actually be true without it being a factual occurrence, right? I want you guys to think about that for a second, right? That something could be true, but it may not be historical fact, right? And this might be pushing some of you to think a little more deeply about something you hadn't thought about, but let's look at what myth actually is. So it's a Greek word, mythos. It comes from a Greek word, and it means a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon. It's typically involving supernatural beings or events, right? And none of this says that it's false, right? 2, a story or a set of stories that's relevant to or having a significant truth or meaning for a particular culture, religion, society, or another group, right? Again, nothing about this says that it's false. It's a cultural story, significant truth, conveying significant truth or meaning. 3, it's anything delivered by word of mouth. So it's a story, a tale, a legend, especially a poetic tale, right? According to this definition, then, all creation stories, including Genesis 1-3, would be myth, right? And nowhere in this definition does it say it's false or untrue, just like any other creation myth. So here are some questions to consider then, right? Just for your personal reflection. You're welcome to journal right now, right? Just to think and reflect on this for your own edification. How do you determine what's true or false? Right? How do you, your community, collectively, how do we determine, how do you personally determine if something is true or false? Is it based on evidence, based on opinion? What if you have no historical evidence for your belief and neither does someone else? What if there's no historical evidence, but you still believe it's true? Does it make it true or does it make it false if there's no evidence? Who's right? How do you determine who's right? How do you determine who's wrong? Does someone have to be right and does someone have to be wrong? Is that even important? I know, you guys, these are tons of crazy deep questions, but the reality is that's what this class is about. It's about living the questions, right? Thinking more deeply about things, about existential questions, the questions of existence that have mattered to people all across time. Let's head to that next slide. So here are some words that I want you to know, to be familiar with as we continue to talk about this and as you write about this for this week. So the first one is Genesis. So this word, Genesis, for the book of Genesis in the Bible, just means the origin or mode of formation of something. So basically, in Greek, this word, genesis, means beginning or birth. Now, a creation story, a story about the genesis of the earth, is called a cosmology or a cosmogony. Now, it's called that because in Greek, right, this word cosmos means world or order. And in Greek, logos, or logi, right, biology, for instance, right, bio meaning life, logi means word, reason, discourse, or the study of. So this is a word that we're familiar with. So cosmology then would be a discourse or the study of words about the world and about order. And a cosmogony, then genos comes from the word Genesis, so the origin of the world. So a cosmology then is a story about the world and its ordering or creation. It's also often, a cosmology is also often an etiology. I know it's a lot of words, stick with me, okay? An etiology, it's the investigation, attribution, or explanation of the cause or reason for something. Now, if you've already read Wong for this week, you'll see that on page 3, she talks about creation stories being etiologies. So just to be clear then, an etiology is a story that explains something, right? It's giving a reason or a cause for something, all right? So then the question that I have posted here is, why are there cosmologies and etiologies in every culture? Why do you think? And some of you, those of you who've already read Wong, right, I want you to think about what Wong says. Why would there be cosmologies and why would there be etiologies? What are their purpose? What do we all have in common, right, across cultures and time? We all are curious about how we got here, why we're here, right? And what our purpose is. This is a common question that has been asked throughout time, and none of us can access directly what actually happened, how we actually got here, right? It only comes through inspiration and investigation, right? So using our minds and potentially our faith tradition, whatever that may be, right? Or our philosophy. So it could be Buddhist, it could be Christian, it could be Muslim, right? You could be possibly atheist and only believe strictly in science. But everybody is interested in how we got here and why we're here. So Genesis 1-3, like the Nuwa and the Purusha Sukta myths, which we'll read for this week, is a cosmology and an etiology. So here's my next question. What do you think that Genesis is explaining? If creation stories are also etiologies meant to explain something, right? So outside of being a literal story, to tell about something, if they're actually explaining something for the hearers or for the readers, right? At this time, they're an oral culture, right? So they were not writing when they were telling this story, and it was passed down from generation to generation, right? They're trying to explain what? What do you think? How about this? What about order? What about why there's temptation? What about cause and effect? God said, don't do it, you did it, and so there are repercussions, right? So right and wrong, right? It's teaching about sin and punishment. It's teaching about labor in the field and labor in birth, right? An explanation for why do people have to work for a living? Why isn't everything just given to us, right? Why are women in pain giving birth to something that is the most beautiful thing, ostensibly life, right? Why does it hurt so much? Well, this story explains why women are in pain. Because way back when Eve and Adam ate the apple, and so now childbirth hurts, right? The other thing that's interesting also is way back then, a lot of women died in childbirth. So it was interesting that in order to give life, right, to create new life, sometimes people had to die for it. Again, things that are so confusing that we need some sort of an explanation for, right? Stories like Genesis help us with that. It also explains pain and suffering. It explains why there are snakes that have no legs at all slithering on the ground and why they're so annoying. When you're a people who works in the field, right, snakes are the number one issue that you have. Besides drought, right, the weather. Anyhow, it also explains clothes, right? Why don't we just walk around naked all the time? Because they were ashamed, and so they had to cover themselves. And then it explains shame. So the last thing that I want to touch on too is this piece about what an ideology is, right? So Sonia Wong speaks to this, and she talks about these creation stories conveying ideologies. So an ideology then is a set of opinions or beliefs of a group or an individual, and it's often referring to a set of political beliefs or ideas that characterize a particular culture or a framework of interpretation, right? So ideology, right? These are the ideas sort of that influence your framework, your worldview, your perspective. So we'll talk a little bit more on that. Wong specifically is thinking about this in terms of gender, right? So now let's take a look at the essays. Or I'll see you on Wednesday.